Hello and welcome to A-Team Group's webinar on how to make the most of market data. My name's Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at A-Team Group and I'll be moderating the webinar. Our expert speakers today are Martina Sutherland, Global Head of Market Data at Fidelity International, David Bentley, Head of Global Operations UK and Ireland at SIX, and Hugh Davidson, Head of Data Management at Man Group. I'll be asking our speakers to introduce themselves in just a moment, but first some info for you so you can make the most of the webinar. To the right of your video screen, you will see a Slido panel. We'll be running 3 poll questions today, so do please vote so that we can gauge what the industry is thinking in the areas we're talking about. And you'll also see a panel for your questions, so please place your questions there whenever you'd like to. We'll gather them up and put them to our speakers a bit later on in the webinar and try and answer as many as we can. So please do just keep putting them there, and as soon as we have quite a few, we'll get them answered for you. So that's it from me for now. So thank you very much indeed. And let me come to the speakers to introduce themselves. Martina, please set off on this one.
So I'm the global head of Market Fidelity. I have 30 people in my team, and they are based across Asia, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Dublin, London, and mainland China, Dalian. I work across investment management, technology, and operations.
Thank you very much indeed. And over to you, David. David seems to be frozen, so Hugh, let me come to you next.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, yes, Hugh Davidson, Head of Data Management at Man Group. I'm responsible for monitoring the usage and cost attribution of core market data here at Man. And I also manage the business intelligence development function. My take on today's topic is going to be more around how to understand the usage and why we're using market data rather than the market data itself.
Okay, fine. Gosh, we've got questions on that too. David's obviously having a little bit of technical difficulty, so let's get started with an audience poll, and I'll ask him to introduce himself when he's back. So the poll is, what are the challenges of sourcing, implementing and consuming market data at your organization? As you can see, the list is pretty long, but please feel free to tick as many of the boxes as are appropriate to your organization. And while you do that, let me come back to Martina to set the scene and talk about these challenges of sourcing, implementing and consuming market data.
So this answer really multifaceted, and I'm going to start with the challenges of market data first. So first of all, we're trying to be efficient on cost. This can be really tricky when we have long-term agreements, we have overlapping data, we have different ingestion mechanisms, having to source more data than required because of regulation. Incomplete data sets, as well as lack of standardization. I think ESG is an excellent example of this. Lack of competitiveness and alternatives in the market. When we look at implementing and also consuming the data, something that we all struggle with, and I thought Hugh will agree with me here, is the complex usage rights here. So the rules of distribution and redistribution of data, individual rights, location, application, display, non-display. This is just a few things that we have to adhere to. And the impact and consequence of this is that we become non-compliant so quickly. Now, the cost of change, many people don't know, but we just rent the data as an organization. If we want to change vendor, we have to purge the data, and that's almost sometimes not in line with retention policies and regulations. Now, and some of the commercial agreements are not in line with cloud technology. We're also experimenting with data is really tricky. Also, the way we want to use the data conflicts with how we're allowed to use the data specifically for POCs. And as a consumer of market data, we might only want one benchmark, but we have to buy the whole family. And that was my final point.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you. Hugh, what would you add to that? There are a lot of challenges here, obviously some more difficult than others. What do you see?
There certainly are. I mean, I would echo a number of the points that Martina made. I mean, from my side, I think the overriding message is that data can be very expensive. So you really need to have kind of a clear understanding about what you need and why you need it. Also, there's various pros and cons of the offerings from different vendors. Don't necessarily go with the cheapest. Sometimes the more expensive one has better coverage. So you really need to consider what you're actually paying for. And as Martina says, you need to be very careful about what you plan on doing with the data. So if you plan on storing it down in the database or sharing it or publishing it, you need to make sure that any kind of commercial agreement you have in place with a vendor permits that. You can't just kind of pay for the cheap offering and do whatever you want with it. You have to make sure that you're fully compliant, and you have to make sure that you're able to monitor your compliance and ensure that you stay compliant as well. How you interact with the vendor is another good point. I mean, different vendors have different mechanisms, from API through to the more kind of classic flat file downloads. So think about how you're going to do that. And if you're dealing with multiple vendors, of course, you're going to have multiple interactions, multiple mechanisms. So make sure that you can kind of support all of those and monitor and keep on top of them. I say my kind of key focus is really around understanding the usage of the data, how it gets into the building, who's using it, and is it being used correctly. So that's kind of my kind of key takeaway on that one.
Okay, lovely. Let's see the poll results, if we may. And Martina, having jotted it down, as it were, many of the challenges, what would you say to that in terms of what our audience is finding perhaps most difficult?
Yeah, look, I really agree with that. And I think it goes back to regulation. Multiple sources of market data are needed. I think that's the thing. And it's just coming, there's so many, we're coming into new markets. And also the implementation. I think we're so restricted in how our commercial agreements, how we can use that data. So that also creating sort of a cost, and the cost of changing. I think that's the thing. In terms of being able to do back testing, we need to have that old data. So it goes back to my earlier point, cost of change. The fact that we're only renting the data, that causes a lot of problems for people in our industry to understand that. And then when you tell that to the business, you have to pay so much to store the data. So yeah, I'm actually not surprised at all
by those. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much indeed. And David, let me bring you back in here. Please introduce yourself, and then perhaps you can head off into the next question, which considers the importance of market data and its existing and emerging use cases. But please do introduce yourself first.
Yeah, so I'm David Bentley. I am the head of global operations for SIX, covering the UK and Ireland. So that covers our customer support function, it covers customer administration, it covers data production support, and it covers data acquisition. So to answer the question around market data, well, market data has always been of primary importance, and pricing has been at the very core of that since the very beginning. So you start with your asset pricing first, and then everything follows on. So reference data, fundamentals, and derived, that's all, I guess, ancient history now. More recently, it's been data sets such as ESG and sanctions, and we've just done publicly traded partnerships, for example, and related regulations. I think the other story, though, as well as use cases, is, of course, the delivery channels. So there's API and cloud delivery. So that's really increased a lot over the last 5 or so years. But going back to emerging use cases, I think one that really stands out for me is retail wealth, particularly the mobile apps. So I'm sure, a number of us have got these apps on our phones with details on, your shares or your ISA account. So an ISA account for non-UK folk is a savings account that's tax-free, and it's got, all the fund information that you've invested into, and it tells you when it's jumped or dropped in value, and I get pinged, if it's gone up 5 or 10%, or down for that matter, as has recently been the case. But there's similar functionality for shares and share dealing. Some people have even got CFDs. I mean, I'm quite vanilla in my outlook, but I know people who've got all sorts on theirs. So emerging use case for me, definitely retail wealth, and I think that's going to continue to grow with demand for more information, such as ESG, onto those apps as well.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you. And Hugh, what would you say there? You mentioned earlier that, your interest is greatly in the usage of the data. What's important at the moment, and what do you see emerging?
I mean, certainly within my organization, data underpins everything. To David's point, it's the thing that goes into virtually everything we do. So having good data is vital. we're using it to inform investment decisions. We're using it to measure our relative performance against benchmarks and a whole myriad of other things as well. What am I seeing in terms of emerging use cases? I think there's been an explosion over the last few years around kind of some fairly niche data sets. There's data sets for just about everything now. So one of the challenges is really understanding what you need and what's more of a nice to have and what you really don't need at all. And again, I think to David's point, he mentioned ESG. I mean, that's of increasing importance, has been over the last few years. And with ESG so central to what we do, having the ability to check, to screen our investments, to make sure that they are kind of ESG compliant is vital. So all those kind of new emerging data sets are really crucial to what we do, along with the more traditional kind of traditional market data sets from people like Bloomberg and the like.
Okay, thank you both very much indeed. And let's run another audience poll. If your organization is investing in or planning to invest in market data, why is this? Again, you have a relatively long list to choose from. So while you tick your options, let me come back to Martina to talk about why now is the time to invest in getting your market data right.
Well, market data, like you were saying, is just constantly increasing. So for us, the three main drivers, it's cost, volume, and regulations. And in terms of cost, the vendor is squeezed on the margins, and they're looking to find other revenue streams, how they can monetize their products. But also as a firm, it's the same for us. We're fee compressing business. We can't increase our prices. So we have to see how can we be mostly competitive and also combat those prices. The same as volume is another driver for processing, handling, storage, managing that data. Volumes are not going down, as you were saying, we're just pushing more and more data. So we need to become better at managing data. And sometimes it's really tricky to understand what is the value of the data that we're paying for? How do we show that? And I think my last point is regulation, and that is ever changing. And that is a huge challenge for us. In order for us to fulfill the requirements, we might need to go to 3 different providers to buy those data sets to fulfill that requirement. I mean, SFDR is a good example of that, but also MiFID in the past, so many. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. David, when you were out there in the market and people are talking about what they're going to buy, what they need, what are you seeing? Where are you seeing the investment going? And is now a good time to be doing this?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of whether the time is right, then I think if you want to grow your business and you're going to have to grow your data sets. If you need to cut costs, and I think there's that cycle's now coming back in to fashion, then operational efficiency matters. So data always costs more than people, believe that or not. And the point with both of these aspects is that good quality data and coverage underpin that. So what we know from our own studies that we've done is that data accuracy is by far and the most important aspect. It trumps everything else. Coverage and normalization are obviously important as well, but they're lower down. And then costs. So for me, it has to be now. In truth, it was yesterday, but now is the next best option. If you don't invest now, what happens is your businesses risk not being able to offer services, such as the ones I mentioned on retail wealth, and competitors will come in and deliver that. So using that example, if I'm out there looking for a retail wealth app, then I'm going to choose the one that's got the best data on it. So it's got my ESG categories that I want to look at, and it's got historical pricing, it's got fundamental data. So if you can offer that, then you've got that competitive advantage.
Okay.
One other point, if I may quickly. So
Sure.
Compliance, I think you just touched on it as well, is so important at the moment. It's really tightening in the industry just now. We're seeing increasing trend of our primary data sources, such as exchanges, getting a bit stricter on this. They're requiring end user licenses for non-premium data, such as end of day pricing. If you don't get this license properly, then you're going to have audits and fines, and that's going to be more costly than sorting out that problem in the first place. So that's another area where we're seeing a bit of demand in addition to the additional or the data sets such as ESG.
Okay. Fine, let's see what our audience has to say here, and perhaps David, you'd like to comment on these poll results. So
Well, there you
investment,
go.
as you say, to improve data quality, accuracy, and timeliness.
Yeah, and you see, I didn't even see that. I just know that's what we've been told in
some
previous
people wouldn't
studies.
believe you.
Yeah, so there you are.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
And people tell us that's important. We know it's important, and we know why as well. If you don't have that accuracy and you don't have that quality, then you've got to put additional headcount into solving those problems, and that costs money and it costs time. So that's good. I think what else is down there? Good to see that new services, that suggests there's a bit of a growth mindset on at the moment. That's great, good to hear. And it looks as well, number 3 on the list is diversity. So getting some market data from new sources. Yeah, I think that matches what we see too.
But as you say, at the heart of it, quality, accuracy, and timeliness on which everything else is built. Absolutely. Yeah. We talk about that in most webinars, if I've got anything to do with data, but yes, a very, very fundamental point. Thank you for that. So let's move on with a little bit of blue sky thinking. And can Martina, please, would you tell us, in an environment with no restraints on budget, resources, and so on, how do you see the ideal market data scenario for both users and vendors? And then
in an ideal world, we would
carry on that one, and then we'll come back to the reality.
Okay. Well, actually, I do have I have this solution to
do
this,
you?
but I can wait to say it. So basically, I think the collaboration between an ideal world, we all collaborate together, vendors and consumers, where our input would help with the products, so they could benefit us. We would help with the roadmap for the vendors. And from a client point of view, we want a concept like Snowflake Marketplace, where we can make market data available for everyone, one place for everyone to use, where we can also curate the data. We also want data democratization, where everyone can have access to data, what they need. And would it be interesting if everyone could get the data, what they needed, and we as a market data function didn't have to be the cost police. And also where people can have a great idea and the cost is not prohibitive to even try it out. And I'll wait with my solution.
Okay, let me hear then from Hugh, if I may, on the how you'd like it to look, given the choice with no restraints.
I'll give a slightly flippant answer, but in an ideal world where there is no budget constraints, then you'd get everything about everything and make it available to everyone. But of course, that is costly and not really a possible. But yeah, I mean, I think to echo Martina's point, it's to do with kind of getting the right data to the right people and not being constrained by the cost of it effectively.
Okay, and David, from a vendor perspective, what would you say there?
Yeah, so for me, I think I see streamlined processes as core here. So this is things like data ordering tools, auto licensing, that allows us to, focus on the delivery aspect. So, it's easy to focus on the market data and itself, and that's obviously important, but it's never going to be perfect. So if you look at the ordering and handling process, I know that some of our larger institutions in our sector, they've got dozens, if not hundreds of people working on this, and that's not an exaggeration. It's a highly manual process, and some outsource it, but it's still a manual process in the outsource operation. And if you've got imperfect metadata or data on the market data, so this is, the data on the licenses, that just causes inefficiency all the way through the chain, to invoice payments. So I think there can be much better automation and standards here. So I would like to see a scenario where market data users can request these data sets and go through a single approval channel to the provider, with licensing, recording, reporting and billing all handled automatically straight through. Okay, there are some elements of this happening already, but it's really far from joined up, and it's certainly not universal. And it's nothing like what the music industry do. If you think about, how you license and listen to music, we're decades away from where they are on that. But hey, I'm interested to know what Martina thinks, because she's got a solution as well.
I think that actually I was going to use that as an example, but I didn't know if I was showing my age. You know, I think we should have a metered model. So instead of like paying for the whole album, you can pay for the 2 songs that you're listening to. And so I think that also provides transparency and actually a preview to the data you actually need. I think actually cloud service providers does this really well, but I think that would be sort of a pay-as-you-go model would be what I would have the future as.
Okay. And Hugh, how do you see the everyday challenges being faced by financial institutions?
And again, so from my side, it all comes down to kind of, if you accept that you can't have everything for everyone, which is my earlier point, then it comes down to working out exactly what you need and in what way you need it as well. So focusing in on the data that you need is vital. Thinking in advance about what your use cases are, whether it needs to be real time, delayed, whether it's going to be a black box usage, whether you need to make it available to users is important. You need to get that worked out, because that's what your commercial agreement is going to say you can do with it. So that's what you have to do with it. I think also ensuring you've got a way to manage costs in the future as well. So you might kind of budget X amount for the next year based on kind of assumptions about what you're going to do with the data. But of course, assumptions change. The reality on the ground is that suddenly 6 months into the new year, you need to expand the amount of data you get, or you need to get something extra you weren't budgeting for. So you need a way of kind of monitoring and managing those costs. So keep on top of what you're spending, understand what you're spending and what's causing what's driving the costs, and make sure that you have a way of monitoring that as well, so that if you're say you're paying per request, or say you're paying for kind of number of unique securities in price bands, you need to know as you're approaching the next price band, or as your usage goes up per unique request, and you need to kind of alert on that, make people aware, make the decision makers who sign the checks aware that you're about to change. And the thing with the kind of the bandings as well, which is really important to remember, is that you face like a cliff edge increase in costs. So say you're paying in bands and you tick over into the next band by just a single security, that could result in a massive multi-tens of thousands or even multi-hundreds of thousands dollar increase over what you're paying before. So you need to kind of be aware that that's coming, be aware and prepare for it, and make sure that the people who kind of sign off the checks are in agreement as well. The other point I would sort of finish on that one is back to something Martina and I mentioned earlier, which is around enforcing kind of access rights. So you need to make sure that if you're bringing data into the building which has restrictions on usage, you have a way of enforcing that usage. So you're not just kind of making it available for everyone to do what they want with. You need to make sure that if it's limited to New York traders, only New York traders can access it, and the London back office staff can't. So make sure you think about that. It's not just getting the data in, it's how you kind of manage it ongoing.
Okay, thank you. And over to you again, David. What do you see as some of these solutions to some of these challenges that FIs face?
Yeah, that's a really good point here around control. And I think some of the platform and technology partnerships with licensing arrangements built in, based on these predefined use cases, I think they offer the best opportunity perhaps for firms to leverage their market data. So I know at SIX, we've got a large and increasing number of partnerships with platform providers. So these platform providers specialize in specific service areas, and they provide both the internal processing software and the customer facing platform. So I think Martina mentioned, the one that she's got, but, they've, by linking in the data into the software, you then have a one-stop shop in terms of provisioning, and that should cater for the use case and should keep it restricted. Some are more inclusive than others. So, some require, the data sources to be separately licensed, and some are, fully included, but basically they are packaged together. I think, though, just as a caveat, there is a risk of consolidation, and probably need to watch this, that there's going to be a limited choice of technology providers. So in some cases, in some sectors, we're seeing that there's one or two dominant firms where you almost have to use them if you want to service that business. But certainly that suggests they've got a successful model, even if it does cause monopolistic issues. But the packaged use is definitely a good solution to a couple of these problems that Hugh and Martina have aired.
Okay, that's great. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the technical side of things, and let's have our audience take a last audience poll if they would. And the question here is, what are the key market data delivery options your organization uses or is considering using? Once again, you have quite a long list, so please tick any of the options that are relevant to your organization. And while you do that, let me come back to David and say, how are trends in data distribution and managed services? How can these help firms make the most of market data? You talked a little bit about the packaged situation there. How are these differences in trends, APIs, and so on? How does this help people?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see the poll result, because we've got our own research which suggests that there's a lot of growth in interest areas such as API and the cloud. So we've got those platform providers that I talked about tying in the data from us and from other data vendors, and to do that, we're seeing an increasing amount of interest in API connectivity. So, for example, we can offer this now on multiple interchange formats that we weren't able to do before. So we've got JSON, GraphQL, WebSockets, so we've got all of that. And then the advantage of this over some of the more legacy connection methodologies is that you've got on-demand access. So it's not like FTP where you get a flat file and you've got to wait, or you've got to pull the next one. You've got on-demand access, and that's to our whole content universe. So that's a real game changer for those customers that want that. Definite trend there. What else? So we've got what else? On API. So one of the things that came out of one of our studies was that API is already well established in sell side already. So 75% was the stat I saw earlier that use or intend to use it within the next couple of years. So that's really high. Now buy side is much lower. It's less than 50%. But then if you switch over to cloud, it's the other way around. So the buy side are big on cloud, and they're using partnerships to get their data through the cloud, from the likes of us, and then we're using intermediaries as well to help them connect to their target cloud environment, and that allows the likes of us to enable access to all manner of different cloud environments. So we've got that capability through other parties, and we've just built our own 6 data cloud. So that's it's in beta just now, but it will be available in prod next quarter. So there's loads going on in that space in particular. But yeah, I'm interested to see the poll results, because I know there's still a lot of legacy and use as well of data ingestion.
For sure. But first, before we reveal the results, Martina, let me come to you as a consumer. What sort of trends in data distribution, sort of variations are you keen on, and what would you say is important?
So I would say the themes are very much the same as for David, and a lot of our partnership are with some of the cloud providers, but also with some of the vendors. I can't mention any names, but yeah, so in that same vein. So I would say the concept of marketplaces and data sharing is something that we're seeing and also applying. The one-stop shop for market data. We have clear description of the data, the user and schemas. Data sharing, where we can mix our own our fidelity data with market data. And also finally, Snowflake is a really good example where you can scale as needed, but also all the points that David also mentioned, I would agree with. Okay, so certain times, but lots of options to still consider and maybe move on to, depending on how that goes. Excellent. Actually, there's another point I would like to make before we do move on, which I think is quite interesting. It's also how actually buy-side firms are evolving in terms of distributing the data. I think a lot of buy-side firms are looking to create their own products and commercialize them. So what we're actually seeing is that how are we creating partnerships with other vendors so we can add value to their products, but also them add value to our products. So I think we will see a lot of buy-side firms coming out there becoming vendors themselves, but also buy-side firms helping disruptors in the market, because one of the problems that we're having is that monopolistic behavior. So I think that is also another trend that we are seeing to make them break the market. Yeah.
Okay, splendid. Your time is up. Could we see the poll results? And over to you, David.
Oh, wow. So there you go. API right at the top, hey?
Yeah, the forecast day.
Yes, and that is the forecast. So that is not surprising because of the ease of using API solutions. They're very configurable. And as I said, they give you on-demand access to huge array of data sets. So they're very popular as well with technologists. We know that this is the way forward. So that doesn't surprise me. I think what's interesting as well, you've got cloud in number 2. So as mentioned, that's also a growth area. And real-time streaming too. So that's obviously your market data feeds, which continues to be very much a core theme. I think what's interesting here is some of the lower placed items. So sure, there's still quite a lot of delivery through the flat files, so the FTPs and the SFTPs and the MFTs. So these are still very much the backbone, I would say, of a lot of data delivery, particularly reference data. But even for snapshot pricing, for example, there's still a lot of usage of this technology, and it will continue to be supported. Obviously, we've gone through the migrations now of FTP to SFTP, so they've still got a future. And then, further down, managed services. Okay, that's actually a little bit lower than I was expecting, but I guess that's something that does have growth potential, and possibly it might depend on your interpretation of what those managed services are. So, if you're using a software provider to get your data in, you might not see that as a managed service. You might well see that as something that you're managing yourself. And of course, if you're outsourcing it, you might see it as a managed service. So that would kind of make sense, I suppose. And then lastly, the good old email and HTTP. So that delivery mechanism has been around a while, but it still remains popular even with some of the really large institutions, just simply because some of the large institutions have been around the longest. They've got some old technology, and that technology requires traditional methods to get the data in. So we'll be continuing to support all for a long period, but certainly the trend is API.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you everybody for voting. And if I may come back to you, David, let's talk a little bit about what technologies and solutions are helpful here. We've talked about API. Are there particular things, machine learning coming to the fore here, or other kinds of AI or natural language processing, other technologies which can really help to sort out the data? I mean, you're not duping data, deduping data and all that sort of thing. Are there technologies that can help?
Yes. So, I mean, you mentioned language learning and bots, for example, which have a role to play. There is, let's take language learning, for example. So service bots, that could be definitely something that takes off. We use them, for example, to a limited fashion within, customer support to help route queries. The responses, though, are still monitored and are reviewed by a human, but I think in the coming years that will change. And I don't want to scare anyone. We've all had experiences with chatbots, some good, some not so good, but they're here to stay. And I was trying to book an optician appointment the other day, and I was chatting with a chatbot, and everything went smoothly. I thought, oh well, that's interesting, isn't it? That wouldn't have been the case 10 years ago. I would have gone mad and phoned them. But we will see, I think, the use of that technology for market data users to chat with their data provider and say, hey, where is this data? Rather than, say, raising queries or even using a search box. Do you know, I saw a query yesterday, well, it was yesterday or day before, but it came in overnight, and it was someone looking for an obscure S&P index on our system, and they couldn't find it. Fortunately, you know, our overnight team sorted it, so it was a follow the sun thing. So it was okay. You know, they got a response within a couple of hours. But really, you know, we would expect now that the use of that sort of technology for people to chat in, and you get a very sophisticated bot that can actually go away and determine that information almost real time. So I've harped on a little bit about that, but in terms of data itself, we've talked about the deliveries through API, so I don't need to go over that ground. But I think in terms of qualitative analysis, there are so many tools out there that we're seeing within you know, data production support that enables you to look for anomalies. And certainly we're doing a lot more monitoring of pricing data that we weren't doing before. So for example, in the past, you might just deliver data honestly as it was from the source. Well, now we're doing some validation checks to make sure that, you know, that data is in good shape and in good form, and that's sometimes at the instrument level. So there's a danger of putting latency onto that, and we don't want to do that. But with the technology in place now, you can do you know, very quick real-time checks on that data, and that is something that has changed and is continuing to change.
Okay, fine. So lots of moving parts here. So let's try and pull some of these together. And I'm going to come to Hugh first on this question. So Hugh, talk us through a case study of a firm or organization, a firm that's changing its approach to market data. And it doesn't necessarily have to be your firm.
Sure. I mean, I think this kind of applies to a lot of firms, what I'm about to say. So I think historically, firms often focused on kind of the complexities of onboarding data, and probably did that in a way that at the time they did it was fit for purpose. So, you know, they onboarded the data that was required. They made sure it was permissioned to the right people in the organization. They made sure it was stored in the right manner. All good. And then over time, you know, things change. People kind of don't keep tabs of who's using it or where it's going or how much is being brought into the building. And over time, you know, firms that do that run the risk of kind of creeping away from where they should be in terms of compliant usage of the data. And I think certainly everywhere I've worked, you know, there's an understanding that you need to keep on top of that, and you need to be cognizant of the fact that the data providers are getting more and more kind of hot in terms of monitoring what you're doing with the data, who's using it. So I think, you know, any firm that kind of legacy brought data on and didn't really think too much about how it's going to be used have had to change, and they've had to put in place the kind of checks and balances to ensure that not only was it fit for purpose at the time they onboarded it, but it continues to be. And I know I keep on banging on about it, but you know, it's the idea of continuous monitoring of usage, and is it still fit for purpose? Are you still doing with the data what you're permitted to do with the data? It's keeping on top of who's using it, why they're using it, how much does it cost, all that sort of stuff. What I can say as a kind of positive point of encouragement is that most data vendors, certainly the ones that I've dealt with, make doing that relatively easy. They can provide very kind of detailed usage analytics around the data that you're requesting, what requested it or who requested it, all that kind of stuff. So it shouldn't be that hard to kind of leverage that kind of usage analytics, the metadata about the data, to understand if you're using it, you know, in a permitted way, as in, you know, is your actual usage aligned to the permitted usage that the contractuals say.
I also think, like, to Hugh's point, I think it's really important to stress this. And the reason we need to stress that point is because if you don't have the right controls in place, you can get millions of fines if you get audited. And I think we just need to call it out. And it's a huge scare for us as consumer firms. And it's and the fact, like I mentioned in my early point at the beginning, is with this complex usage, right? We might have the right environment 2 years ago, but with policies changing every 6 months, we might be uncompliant by the end of the two-year period, even though we signed that contract with all the right controls. So that continuous watching is super important. And also getting understanding, making the business understand that can be quite tricky until you get that audit and you get that big fine. And then it becomes like a wake up call. So I think I just want to stress that point.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think you need to factor in not just the cost of the data, but the cost of putting in place those kind of checks and balances, because it may seem like an unnecessary cost to build those kind of checks and balances in, but that will pale into insignificance compared to the cost that you'll get if you get fined for using the data incorrect.
Right.
So, yeah, it's important.
Okay, let's come back to that use case study, if you like. David, what would you like to add there in terms of, that's approached this kind of thing and the steps they've taken?
Yeah, so I mean, what Hugh was talking about, and Martina as well, absolutely right. And good to bang on about them as well. But I'll go on a different tack, I think. So a use case that I know has changed, through my own experience being elsewhere, is, with at least a couple of security pricing firms have gone through hubbing over the last sort of 10 years, and that's still evolving. And this has been a definite trend. And in both cases, and I know it's wider than just two use cases, but it started off with a relatively primitive approach. You'd have a couple of data feeds if you're lucky, and that would be it. You might do some validation, and it would be prices out. Now, when I was starting off, or not quite starting off, when I was mid-career, I suppose, I can remember we would have, if there was a data feed failure, for example, you would have to stay and fix the problem, and you wouldn't be able to go home, or the team wouldn't be able to go home until the vendor had solved its problem and you had received a reworked file and you'd been able to deliver your job. Well, that's really moved on. So these Data Hub operations now bring in multiple feeds, not just 2, sometimes up to 6, and they plug them into this software. And if one of them goes down, it's fine. They can switch to another one. And I know it's not quite as simple as that, because there are all kinds of differences in terms of coverage and source expectation, but it means that instead of, say, having a 6 or a 12-hour delay, you're maybe going to have a 10-minute or a hour's delay at max. So that's really changed. They've also continued this, and this is what's happening right now, is by onboarding multiple business areas. So instead of just one single business area that might be interested in, I don't know, fund valuation, for example, they're being able to bring in other departments that also have pricing requirements. And the reason this has taken so long is because they've got such different requirements in terms of, price types and price sources and validation rules. But what's happened is the software is there now, that flexibility is there to allow all of that variation in requirements to be managed. So yeah, that for me is the use case of market data that's changed so much over the last 5-10 years.
Okay, thank you for all on that one. And let's take a quick break and take on some audience questions here. And I'm going to put this one to Hugh, I think, to start with anyway. And it says, given the high cost of data, do you have an effective framework to measure the business value with incremental costs in market data?
I do.
So, well done. How does that work?
So without giving away all the secrets, I mentioned earlier that any kind of good data provider will generally provide you with kind of usage analytics. So you not only get the data, but you get like a regular summary, be it weekly or monthly, of the data you've requested and what the drivers are behind it. We have built a model where we are able to kind of attribute all requested market data back to a system or person that requested it. and ultimately back to a kind of fund within our organization that benefits from it. So we're able to kind of literally tie all data costs back to either like a house cost bucket, or back to a fund, or back to a kind of driving application. And it allows us to move away from the more traditional kind of model where we perhaps divided up data costs using fixed splits that were maybe set once a year, with one part of the organization paying 10%, another paying 15%. We're now doing monthly real usage driven splits. So we can say month on month, this is the data that was requested last month. These are the splits between who benefited from it. Therefore, month by month, we're literally putting up or down the percentage cost that each bit of the firm has to shoulder. It also allows us handily to kind of monitor something I mentioned earlier, which is, as you're approaching the tipping point to a more expensive data cost, so be it like a cliff edge change for price bands, or be it kind of per security requests, you can get visibility of that, because if you look at it month by month, you can see upward or downwards trends, and you can kind of go and speak to the people or system owners or fund or portfolio managers who are kind of driving those costs, and to kind of understand what the rationale was behind the data being requested, and not police it, but just kind of understand it, give visibility to senior management that these costs are going up or costs are going down. So having that kind of model is really useful, and kind of tying those kind of usage analytics back to your real world usage allows you to do kind of cool stuff like that.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And Martina, something that you've mentioned and said how important it is, but the question is, how best can we track and monitor market data across our organization with a view to cutting costs?
So I think, I hope everyone has an inventory management systems. And I think it goes back to Hugh points where you can actually see, every commercial agreement is tied to an invoice, and that cost is split out even across, operation, investment, technology, and by be able to do that, you can then track exactly how much is each department spending, and then you can go to your CIOs and discuss that spend. You can also look at sort of how much files are you requesting. Are you actually using the data that you are requesting? Are you requesting too many? Are you downloading the data in different environments? Do you have to pay for that 3 times? Can you, change your do technical switch so you cache the data once? So I think in terms of understanding the data and challenge the data, you have to do that by an inventory system where you can drill down to the user. You can see what that person is using. And then what you should be doing is going and challenging that user. Do you really need that? We also do self-certifications every 6 months that goes to the users. But yeah, as David was saying in the beginning, we have huge cost drives now. Most firms have to save money. There's headcounts, there's market data, different ways where we have to make sure that we are more efficient. And I think also it's using the right data that we need and require. But it is a challenge because we can't just buy that data set that we require. We have to buy the whole family set of data. And that is, I think, really frustrating. And that's where, in the future, I would like to have that pay-as-you-go model. And also the opaque pricing that we're facing as consumer firms. We don't always know. I think Bloomberg is great in that. I'm going to call them out. Like, they have a price list. They might be expensive, but I know exactly what I'm paying for. A lot of firms don't have that. And, I know my neighbors across the street are paying 10 times more, or I'm paying 10 times more. This was a great article in the Waters Technology that people can read about, the increasing index costs. So, yeah.
Okay.
That was my answer.
That's great. Okay, this one comes back to something we talked about earlier, and I'm going to pass it on to David. And it says, what are the challenges and opportunities of managed services for market data versus direct consumption?
Yes. Okay. So the choice, I think first off, if you do it yourself and you're managing it yourself, you've got control, as in full control. There are lots of advantages of managed service, in that you can use the expertise at that firm, so that they're specialists in what they're doing. They're often doing it for many other operations like your own, and they know the data and the technology very well. I think one of the challenges, though, is getting and agreeing any bespoke work to be done quickly and on time. So a particular challenge with managed services that if you're doing something that's not of a strategic interest to the managed service provider, then you will struggle to get some of those requirements done quickly. It's not to say they can't be done, and it's not to say you can't encourage them to be done by throwing money at it, but it's what I would say, you know, based on what I've seen and done, a problem area. But it always comes back to the element of control and, crucially, how good your contract is. So how have you covered those aspects with your managed service provider? You know, do you have that flexibility, and do you have the right to insist on changes that you need?
Okay, that's great. And we're coming back to the music industry example, and you commented on that, Martina, so perhaps you could comment on this one. I don't think it has a specific answer, but it says the music industry example is a good one, but it took an uncompliant innovator, Napster, to break the model and change user habits. Who in our industry do you see as taking that risk to break our old and painful habits around licensing and compliance?
I mean, I'm just thinking about the vendors that do kind of have that pay-as-you-go and metered model. I think that are, you know, AWS is a great example. Snowflake is a great example where they have sort of metered usage. You pay for what you use. I think Bloomberg is great for that. I think people are moving towards that model, but I don't like, you know, exchanges there's still a struggle with them. Because it's quite opaque in terms of the terms and conditions. I can't see any sort of front runners. Mainly, I would say the cloud service providers are really the ones I would give a golden star to.
Okay, fine, okay. And one for you, Hugh, and it asks, it's about generative AI, which is something that everybody's talking about. Here we go. Everyone's talking about generative AI. What could that mean for market data?
Oh.
Wow.
I think this is so exciting. Should I jump in first?
Yeah, you go, Martina.
Okay, so I think like this was like one of my points like we're going to get to later, but in terms of the next 10 years, I think this is huge for us. And I think specifically, if you look at the buy side firm, you know, we don't know what's going to happen, but it might impact us. But look, think about like our research departments. Think what that will help with that, you know, writing research notes, equity notes, and company statements. And I think we are already looking at that as a firm or already on our prospectus, our company statements. So I think there will be change here in terms of how we'll be using data. What's going to be interesting is how is this going to be tied into commercial agreements? That's what I would like to see, because we still have archaic agreements that doesn't adopt cloud technology. I mean, you will know this. So how will it cope with generative AI? So I think this is really one to watch.
Okay, Hugh, your comments. Are you watching it or are you running away?
Watching it cautiously, I think. No, I mean, I think everything Martina said is true, but she made a fantastic point at the end there. You know, how are the market data vendors going to adapt to a cost model that, you know, accommodates that kind of thing? I don't know the answer to that, to be honest.
Okay. Thank you for that, both of you. Thank you all. Thank you to our audience for the questions and to our speakers for their answers. I'm afraid we have more questions than we can answer in the time we have. Some have their names attached, and I will share them with SIX, our sponsor. And if you want to attach your name, please feel free to do so. And I'm sure SIX will try and get back to you and talk a little bit about your questions. So thank you all for those. So coming to our last two questions, we'll have to keep it fairly swift. And Martina, we talked about what you'd like it to look like. What do you expect the market data landscape to look like in 10 years' time, and what challenges will it bring?
Look, I think we're going to have continued increased volume and regulation. I think the other point is technology and digitalization. We still have challenges in how we price in crypto, ESG, also new markets. How do we evaluate countries such as Saudi, China, India? I think we will see big players still dominating. You know, we have the mergers with LSEG, and Refinitiv, S&P Market. I think that's going to continue. We're going to have more tech firms. And of course, my final point, generative AI. I think that's one to watch.
Okay. And Hugh?
Well, echo those points. I mean, I think in the next 10 years, we're going to see an increased proliferation of kind of the niche data sets I mentioned earlier. There's going to be more and more providers of more and more different varied data sets. Amongst the bigger providers, there'll probably be kind of consolidation there. We may see more data as a service. I think we're going to see increased volumes of data and increased regulations around how that data can be used as well.
Okay. And David, how do you see things looking quite far into the future?
Yeah, I think we will have chatbots, but these will be supported by generative AI. And I think there'll be that capability to draw in lots of data. And then I think to answer the question around, how do we solve the problem on, billing and usage and licensing, I think there'll be usage metering that will take place to identify that. And there will be an assumption that, what you request will be what you want and what you will need to pay for. But yeah, we're only at the beginning of trying to solve that problem. But yeah, that's where I think we'll be.
That's great. Thank you, all three. So meantime, and my final question to you all, please would you provide some guidance for people who are working to make the most of market data at the moment? And perhaps you'd like to kick off on this one.
I'll kick off. And this again is probably points I've made earlier, so apologies for that. But I think, first and foremost, work out what you need, avoid duplication, work out the best provider for the data that you need. And best isn't necessarily cheapest. Best is generally the one with the best coverage. Again, can't stress it enough. Make sure you don't just factor in the cost of the data, but factor in the cost of monitoring ongoing the use of that data. Build a model that allows you to understand usage, understand costs, even if you're not then using that to divide who pays for it, even if it's just still coming out of a central bucket, just understand what's being paid for so that you don't have any nasty surprises when your usage increases or you tip into another bracket. And finally, make sure you are compliant. Do not use data in a non-compliant way.
Okay. And Martina, sorry, what advice would you provide? Yeah.
Well, very, very, very similar to you. So I think become data-driven in everything that you do and develop skills in analyzing and understanding the data. I think it's key for our functions. Be able to understand the data requirements of the users. To be able to support and also challenge your users is important. And also research your products and trends as an obsession.
Okay, lovely. David, some final words from you.
Yeah, did anyone mention use cases or compliance? So yeah, got that loud and clear. Very much agree with those two. I think on the cost one, so Hugh touched on this. Lowest cost is a false economy. And I'd say also, finally, don't always go for the biggest. Mix things up a bit. If everyone goes for the biggest provider, or for that matter, the provider with the best coverage, as in the widest coverage, you'll end up with a monopoly. We often, in our industry and all industries, we talk about diversity in our people and the tangible benefit of that. Well, what about diversity in your market data supply? So, if you always use a US or UK vendor, why not try something different? Why not try a Swiss one? Just a suggestion.
Okay, fine. Some great messages there. So thank you very much indeed, David. Thank you to all our speakers for providing their expertise and experience. Thank you too, obviously, to SIX for sponsoring today's webinar. Finally, before we close, just a few forthcoming 18 group items that may be of interest to you. We'll be hosting our next Trading Tech Briefing New York on the 8th of June 2023, and you can click on the link there or use the QR code to find out more about that. The lineup is great. It's a long morning only, so you can be back in the office in the afternoon. And you can also sign up for our next Trading Tech Insight webinar on the 6th of June, Market Data in the Cloud, Fueling the Next Generation of Data Delivery Solutions. Or you can sign up for our 5th of October 2023 RegTech Summit London, an event which we'll be holding then in London. So that said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Martina, David and Hugh, and thank you to all of you who have taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear how your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.